welcome to Old Stonewell Farm, home of me, the accidental country pastor. Well, today I am out in the back field of the farm, and I was spending some time walking in the wildflowers, and it just brought back a memory of years ago when I was in first grade, and we had a family trip to Switzerland. My father is Swiss, and thus my Swiss t-shirt, because August 1st was Swiss National Day, and it's a big to-do in our household. So I was out walking and I saw this big field of wildflowers, and it reminded me of when I was a little girl and on a farm in Switzerland. My father grew up in the Alps in Appenzell. And I remember just walking with him one morning out in the fields, and it was just so magical. There was just this carpet of wildflowers. I've never seen anything like that. I mean, I grew up in New Jersey in a congested area. And so just to see this endless carpet of wildflowers, it was just so beautiful. And I remember walking up the hill with him. And as we walked up the hill, you got to the top, and when you looked down below, there was even more wildflowers. And it was just such a moment of beauty. I was too young to really name it and say this is God. But even then, I realized that there was something beyond me. There was something greater than me. There was a creator filled with so much love and grace, a creator that would paint the world such a beautiful place with beautiful colors and flowers. And so today, as I was out walking, I kept thinking about that time in that field in Switzerland and thinking about identity, who I am, who I am that God created me to be, and the things in my life that have shaped me, that have informed me, the twists and turns that have set me in so many different directions that I never ever would have imagined. And so on this time of worship today, we are going to be taking a look at who we are, and we're going to take a look at perhaps the dark places of who we are. We're going to take a look at those moments in which we wrestle with God. And so let us begin our worship to God by taking a deep breath to center ourselves, to take a moment to kind of ask ourselves, who am I? And then take a moment and ask the question to God. God, who am I that you want me to be? And then just lift that up to God. Who am I that you want me to be?
Surrender all to Him. I freely give. I will ever love and trust Him.
Our lectionary lesson today comes from Genesis, and we hear about Jacob wrestling with God. And when I was thinking about this lectionary text, I had Swiss National Day on my mind, being that I am Swiss. My father's from Switzerland. I kept thinking about the reformers, and we know Martin Luther very well. We always hear that name when it comes to celebrating Reformation Sunday, Reformation Day, October 31st, which marks the day in 1517 when Martin Luther in Germany started the Reformation, so it goes, by posting everything that was wrong with the church of the day on the door of a church. He nailed his thesis down on the door. And it started a whole big controversy. But there's another reformer that we don't really hear much about. I know him well because he's a Swiss reformer, Ulrich Zwingli, who is credited to bringing the Reformation about in Switzerland in 1519. So 2 years after Martin Luther nailed his thesis to the door in Wittenberg, Germany, we have Zwingli, who was a pastor in Zurich. And in 1519, he began preaching in the church, the Grand Church in Zurich. And he caused quite a stir because he was actually preaching from the Bible. He would just go through the books of the Bible and just really use those words. And that's something that a lot of people weren't really familiar with. But Zwingli was the Swiss reformer. And, it's really interesting, just a little tidbit to bring to you, that the Swiss flag is a white cross on a red background. Well, it is said that Zwingli, who was also a chaplain in the army, the Swiss army, that basically how the Swiss flag came about, so the legend goes, is that on the battlefield, the fallen men on the battlefield, they had red uniforms on. And so Zwingli would identify who the fallen soldiers were, if they belonged to him, by putting a white cross on them. And so you have the white cross on their red uniforms, and thus the Swiss flag came about. Who we are in Christ. We don't walk around with crosses attached to us. Well, we wear crosses, but Zwingli wanted to mark the men as his, as Christian, who to pray, last rites or to bury them with a Christian burial. And so who we are matters a lot. And sometimes, if I could be honest, sometimes we're not happy with who we are. Sometimes we realize that we could be better. Sometimes we get to a place in life where we don't know what happened to our lives. Like, how did I get to this place? How did I become that person that I thought I was never going to become? I'm really not happy. And if we were to unpack that unhappiness, 9 times out of 10, when we say we're really not happy, it's something going on deep inside of us. We're not happy with something in our soul, something that's not right. And the good news is that when we allow ourselves to identify the darkness in us, to identify the gunk that is in us, when we allow ourselves the complete honesty to be honest with ourselves and with God and say, something's off, something's not right. And lately, I just don't like the person that I've become. Lately, I just don't like how I react to things. I don't like how I respond to people. I'm just not happy. And that happens in our lives. Sometimes we get to that place where things just don't seem right. And so the story of Jacob wrestling with God is a powerful one, because Jacob wasn't an okay guy. If you really follow the story of Jacob, he was the second born of a twin. So his older brother Esau came first. And it is said that Jacob then was born right after Esau, grabbing a hold onto his heel. So like always grabbing, always in second place, always grabbing for something, always wanting something. And so as soon as Jacob gets into this world, he's already holding on to what he thinks he should have, or I should be first. And then the story continues. And well, in fact, Jacob, the word actually translates, the name actually translates into a heel holder. You're holding on to the heel of your brother. And as the story progresses, Jacob is one of those people that you ever had to do a group project with somebody, and you're in this group and it's a group project, and there's always that one person who really doesn't do that much but wants the glory or kind of rides on the coattails of everybody else. And that's Jacob. He always thinks that he deserves everything. He deserves the best. He should be first. And so Esau, his brother who was born first, would get the birthright, would get the blessing from his father, not Jacob. And Jacob wasn't happy with that. And so we see as the story progresses that Jacob, he pulls the wool over his father's eyes, and he swindles Esau's birthright. He takes the birthright away from Esau, and he tricks his father, whose eyesight is failing, and Esau, who is kind of hairy. So Jacob puts on like animal skin. So when the father touches him, he's like, "Oh, all right, you are Esau." And so Jacob steals Esau's birthright. And Esau is really, really mad. And so Jacob flees for his life. And then the story progresses, and Jacob gets married and has a family. And life continues on, but he's still Jacob. He's still holding on to the heel of something, wanting something, like, no, me. It gets to the point where Jacob wants to make peace with his family, and so he goes to head back home. And that's where we get the story today. So he crosses a creek, and he's with his family and his children, and nighttime comes, and a man appears and begins wrestling with Jacob. Angel of God starts to tackle Jacob, and they wrestle. And at first it might seem kind of strange, like, okay, well, all of a sudden there's this person wrestling with Jacob. Like, what instigated this? All of a sudden we hear that Jacob is wrestling with this man, an angel of God. But there is a struggle. And this angel comes, and Jacob fights tooth and nail with this angel. And it goes on, and it's just, the angel will not give up, and Jacob won't give up. And then finally, the angel does something to Jacob's hip, injures Jacob, so he has to stop. So there he is, injured, but he still continues to hold on. He's like, wait a minute, you're not going anywhere until you bless me. I mean, here he is, losing this wrestling match. He gets hurt, and he still insists that he is owed something. What do we make with this story of Jacob wrestling with God? I find it powerful because it reminds me that no matter what dark place that I'm in, or no matter where I am in my life, where I might not be happy with who I am, or I think I deserve more, or I need to change my life around, I know that it's possible. And I know that to get to that place of changing my life around, that part of that process is having it out with God, of wrestling with God, of tackling God, of saying, enough, God, I can't take it. I mean, it's a process. Life is a process. It's not all like, oh, let's come together and praise God and sing happy hymns and you're going to be okay if you're good and you do everything right and you're just generous and love everybody, that God will bless you. And no, the reality is sometimes we're in our own gunk and we can't get out of it. The reality is sometimes we become the people that we really don't like. Sometimes we allow ourselves just to get so caught up in the mess of life that we allow the darkness of life, we allow the negativity of life, we allow the problems of life to change us and not for the better. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes we become bitter. Sometimes we become angry. And if we're not careful, then that can really take over our lives. But Jacob comes to us and shows us that, when we wrestle with who we have become, when we wrestle with the darkness inside of us, when we finally allow ourselves to come face to face with the inner struggle, with the inner hatred, with the inner gunk, when we allow ourselves to be honest with ourselves, only then can we have our story start changing. Our lives will start changing. And so Jacob, who is a conniver, who swindles his brother's birthright out from under him, who was born second, holding on to the heel, who's always spent his life wanting what he thinks he deserves, gets to the point where he realizes that's not who I want to be. And dare I say, maybe he just doesn't like himself. He just gets to the point where I really don't like who I have become. And he takes it out on God and he wrestles. And so the story is also showing us if we are to change, we first need to wrestle with who we are and the things that we have done. We need to come face to face and name and accept and confess all that we don't like about ourselves. And it's okay to yell at God. It's okay to say, God, I just don't like where I am right now. I don't like the life that you are showing me. I really don't understand it. And it's really not what I had in mind. It's okay to tell God that. It's okay just to say, God, what the heck are you doing? It's okay to wrestle with God because God can handle it. And God shows us that. And finally, when Jacob gets to the point of just tiredness and surrender and his hip is hurt to the point where okay, I can't do it anymore. And yet he still holds on. He's like, no, you're not going anywhere, God, until you bless me. God turns around and blesses Jacob. And God gives him a new name, a new identity. From here on out, you will be known as Israel, a name that means wrestles with God. You are no longer Jacob. You are no longer the scheming, conniving person who always comes in second, was born second, grabbing the heel of your brother. You're no longer the person that stole the birthright. You're no longer that Jacob. You are Israel. And I have plans for you. Years ago when I was in seminary, I think I spent my 3 years in seminary wrestling with God. I was a second career, soon to be pastor, in a seminary where there were a lot of younger people who were engaged or married or having babies. I was in my late 30s, second career, no boyfriend, no engagement, no prospects. You see, a few years earlier, I did have a boyfriend, and he was killed in a Jeep accident in Africa. And I just couldn't understand why. Why did I have to lose somebody like that? And why wasn't God hearing my prayer for love to come back into my life? So I'm in my late 30s, still grieving, and I had someone I love taken away from me. And I was just on this lonely path, and I was surrounded by all these people who were meeting others and getting married and starting their lives. And so I spent 3 years in seminary wrestling with God, saying, okay, wait a minute. I had a career. I lived in New York City. I was a magazine editor, and I lose a boyfriend. I give up everything to follow this weird call I have to serve you, God. And you're still not hearing me? You're still not answering my prayer? Like, I'm doing, I think, everything right. I'm your faithful servant. So answer me. And God didn't. And so 3 years in seminary, I was really wrestling. And I remember one night I was in my dorm, and it got to the point where I was just so heartbroken that I wanted to scream and yell. So I took a pillow because I didn't want all my friends to hear. And so I just screamed inside the pillow, and I cried all night. And I was on the floor of my dorm just like, why, God, why? And finally, after hours of crying and yelling and to the point where I couldn't even breathe, I got to the point where I was all cried out. I got to the point where I couldn't even speak anymore. My voice was so hoarse from shouting at God. I got to the point where I was just so tired of wrestling with God that I just fell on the ground, slumped over. And it was then after my wrestling with God, taking God to task and yelling at him and being very angry, it was then, after I was all spent on the floor in my dorm, that this holy stillness came upon me. And I felt God's presence with me. I felt a new identity beginning to form. I no longer was Donna, the New York City editor who basically was pursuing ministry and wanted to get married and have a family. I was no longer Donna, the former New York City editor who would become a pastor with the idea of, okay, I'll serve a church in the suburbs or even maybe the city, a big church. God was giving me a new identity and led me from old Donna, New York City fashion editor, to that of country pastor. I wasn't given a new name, but after my wrestling with God was done, I was given a new direction. And it was in that moment that I began finally letting God lead me beautifully to the country pastures that he would lead me to. I never ever thought that I would be in a place like this. I never thought that I would be a country pastor living in Vermont, surrounded by beautiful green mountains and hills and valleys filled with wildflowers that remind me of my father's homeland in Switzerland, that brings me back to my identity that I had as a child of God who loved running through the wildflowers, who knew, even though I didn't name that moment when I was in first grade, I did not name that beautiful blanket wildflowers in Switzerland that I saw. I did not name that as that is God. But I knew that it was divine. And so from that moment of being a first grader who knew that there was something holy in that Swiss field of flowers, to be brought to Vermont and surrounded by blankets of flowers that reconnects me to who I was. That is God. Sometimes life goes and takes twists and turns, and sometimes we find ourselves being who we thought we weren't going to be, and sometimes we find ourselves not liking who we are. Sometimes we allow the world to really beat us down and to make us bitter. Sometimes we get so caught up with wanting to succeed or thinking that we deserve whatever it is we deserve, that we will find ourselves conniving and scheming and trying so hard to get the life to be who we think we should be. And sometimes we get to the point when it's not happening that we get so mad with God that we just take God to task, and we begin to fight with God and wrestle with God and take God on. And I think that's the most beautiful part of life and point that we can get to, because it's only then when we wrestle, when we really grapple with who we are and what we want, it's only when we really reach out and start to wrestle with God that God, well, finally we will be so tuckered out that finally we will surrender. And it's in that surrendering, it's in that point where we get so tired and we just like, oh, okay, I'm tired of it all, God. I'm tired. I've had enough. Then God can say, okay, you've had enough. That's exactly the point in your life in which your life will begin to change for the better. When you finally admit that you've had enough, that you know that there's a better you that you can be. That's the point in life where life becomes blessed by God. Yes, I spent 3 years in seminary wrestling with God. Not quite sure who God was calling me to be, not quite happy with who I had become, lost dreams, lost hope, lost identity too. I mean, I was losing my identity of being this professional New York City woman, to God only knows where I was going. And so I wrestled with God. And it was right before I graduated seminary that I was having breakfast in the cafeteria, and there was another woman sitting there. We began talking, and for some reason we got onto the topic of our lives, the direction our lives were going, and we got very deep with one another. And I, for some reason, I shared with her the crying match that I had, the wrestling match I had with God, and how tired I was, and how I just shouted out to God. And then I just quietly admitted to her, I just really don't know who I am. I know that I don't like who I am. So who am I going to be? And that's when she smiled at me and she said, you know, you're just like Jacob, wrestling with God. It's going to be okay. Wrestle. All you have to do is wrestle. Wrestle all you need to wrestle. It's okay. Do what you have to do. Yell at God. Be honest with God. Start to face the gunk inside. Start to honestly face all the stuff inside of you that you don't like. Name it. Bring it out. Accept it. And keep on wrestling with God. God can handle it. And then in that beautiful moment, when you cry, Uncle, I've had enough, God will lift you back up. Just say, okay. Now for that blessing. I will give you a new name, perhaps, a new identity, a new chapter, a new path. My child, when you're done wrestling with me, be prepared for a beautiful life to begin, for the blessings to start appearing. Jacob emerged from his wrestling match with God with a new name. I emerged from my wrestling match with God with a new identity. Oh my gosh, no longer this New York City fashion editor with cute little handbags and shoes that matched, always accessorizing my outfits with jewelry. I don't know who that person is anymore, as you can tell. Yeah, I emerged from my wrestling match with God as a country pastor, living in a place that reminds me of my father's homeland, Switzerland, surrounded by wildflowers that bring me back to my childhood, of that moment when I knew that there was something greater beyond me, even though I couldn't name it. So wherever you might be in your life right now, you might be very content or happy, or you might be struggling with something, or you might sense that your life is changing and you don't know quite yet what direction it's going. You might be grieving not a loss of a loved one, perhaps. Maybe you're grieving the loss of youth. Maybe you're grieving the loss of not being able to do things that you used to be able to do. Maybe you're allowing this crazy world and all its negativity to make you bitter. Or maybe you're just allowing it to bring you down. Maybe you've been short with loved ones. Maybe you've been snappy. Maybe you think you deserve more than you're getting. Maybe you think that this is not the life you wanted. Whatever it might be, reach deep inside with whatever negativity or darkness is swirling inside of you. Reach deep inside, fight it out, wrestle with God about it, and then let God come into your life and bless you. New name, new identity, new path. Because God can handle it. God can handle whatever truth that you are afraid to speak, whatever gunk is inside of you. God can handle it, and God can redeem you. Heck, He redeemed Jacob. Imagine what He can do for me and what He can do for you. And so, go and wrestle with God. Have it out with God, because God can take it. And allow God to truly, truly enter into your lives and change you. Until next week, thank you for sharing this time with me here in the back pasture of Old Stonewall Farm. As always, it is just such a blessing to be together. So go forth this week. Don't be afraid of any darkness that is inside of you, any negativity, any bitterness. The shadow side of you is just a shadow side. Face it, name it, give it to God, wrestle with God, and let God turn everything around. Until next week, take care and God bless. Well, any beautiful hike in the fields would not be complete with a picnic or with a moment to break bread together. And so as we heard about God renaming Jacob so that his name was then Israel, and hearing about God's grace with Jacob that gave Jacob, who was struggling with who he was, to become a better person, God allowed Jacob that space to really grapple, to wrestle. And then again, we see at the end of the story, God's grace so abundant upon Jacob. Well, it's not exactly a picnic, but I thought it'd be really nice for us to break bread together, to gather around, not really a table, but to gather in God's beautiful handiwork here in Vermont. And then to remember that through the bread and through the wine, that we are loved beyond loved, and that the promises of God to be with us, to sustain us, to nourish us, the promises that while we might struggle now in this world, when we break the bread and drink from the cup, that not only do we know that we have what we need for today, the strength and the promises, but we know that this is just the foretaste of what is to come, the great heavenly banquet. And so on the night that Jesus was to be betrayed, he was gathered in the upper room with his friends, and after the meal was over, he took the bread that was on the table and he blessed it and he broke it. And he said to all those gathered, as I say to you, all of you gathered with me at nature's table here, he said, take, eat. This is my body broken for you. Remember me. In the same way, he took the cup that was on the table and he poured out the wine. And he lifted it up. And he said that this represents the cup of the new covenant, my blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Drink and remember. Because every time, my friends, that we gather together to break bread and share the cup. What we are doing, we're remembering the promises that are for us right now and the promises that are to come. For every time that we take this bread and we drink from this cup, we proclaim the saving grace of Christ's love until he comes again. And so for all of you who join me every week here at Old Stonewall Farm, I give you the gifts of God. You are God's beloved children. Take, eat, drink, and remember, God is with us. God is always providing for us. And God, as promised, will come again. Thanks be to God.
To the